Moving into a new house is always supposed to feel like a fresh start, right? You unpack your life, decorate rooms just the way you want, and slowly begin filling the unfamiliar space with familiar memories. At least that's what I thought when my wife, Haley, and I bought our dream home last winter. It was one of those big, old-fashioned houses, white wood siding, large windows, and a sprawling front porch perfect for lazy evenings. It had character, charm, and most importantly, it was well within our price range. The first time we stepped foot inside during the open house, we fell in love instantly. The realtor mentioned casually that it had been sitting empty for quite some time after the previous owners moved away unexpectedly. I didn't think much of it. Houses sit empty for all sorts of reasons. Plus, the excitement of finally having our own home overshadowed any doubts or concerns. We moved in on a snowy Saturday in January. Friends helped us unload boxes, while music blasted from a speaker, echoing through the empty hallways. The house seemed welcoming, even cheerful with everyone there. But as soon as our friends left and the sun set behind the bare winter trees, an eerie silence settled over everything, thick and unnatural. Our first night was restless. I woke up several times, hearing faint scratching and rustling noises coming from within the walls. Each time I turned on the bedside lamp, the noises stopped immediately, and I convinced myself it was just the old house settling, or perhaps branches brushing against the side of the house. Haley mentioned hearing something similar, but we were both too exhausted from moving to give it much thought. Things only got stranger in the days following. We noticed small signs of disturbance around the house, crumbs scattered on the kitchen counter, tiny tears in cereal boxes, and an odd, musty smell in some rooms. At first, we dismissed it as being careless or the remnants of unpacking, but it quickly became harder to ignore. Then one evening, as we were preparing dinner, we saw it, a rat scurrying rapidly across the kitchen floor and disappearing under the refrigerator. Initially, we thought it was just one isolated incident. Maybe it was a stray rat that had found its way in due to the cold weather. We bought traps and placed them strategically around the kitchen, confident we could handle it ourselves. But the next morning, the true scope of our problem became horrifyingly clear. Every trap had caught something, and worse yet, there were more rats, unafraid, scuttling openly across the floor. We called an exterminator immediately. When he arrived, he inspected the house thoroughly, and the news wasn't good. He told us grimly that we had a severe infestation, the kind he rarely saw, hundreds of rats, nesting deep within our walls, floors, and even the basement. Our dream home had quickly become a nightmare, and the thought of sharing our space with countless rodents filled us both with dread. The exterminator's inspection turned out to be just the beginning. What he found beneath the surface made my skin crawl. He told us the rats hadn't just nested randomly. They'd made the entire structure of the house their territory. The insulation in the walls was shredded and filled with droppings. They'd gnawed through wires, pipes, and even structural beams. It wasn't just a health hazard, it was dangerous. He said bluntly that if we didn't act fast, the damage could render parts of the house unlivable. We hired him immediately for a full-scale extermination plan. It wasn't cheap. He estimated it would take weeks, and even then, there was no guarantee the rats wouldn't come back unless we figured out how they got in. Haley and I spent those first few nights in the guest room upstairs, trying to stay as far away from the chaos downstairs as possible. But the rats weren't shy. We'd hear them every night, scraping claws, high-pitched squeaks, the sound of their bodies racing inside the walls. One night, Haley woke me up shaking my shoulder. Her eyes were wide, terrified. She whispered that she'd heard something scratching at the bedroom door. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly walked over, half expecting nothing to be there. But when I opened it, I saw them. 3 rats sitting in the hallway, staring right at me. They didn't even flinch at the light. They just sat there like they were waiting for something. That moment flipped a switch in me. It wasn't just an infestation anymore. It felt like the rats weren't scared of us at all, like we were the intruders and they were the rightful owners of the house. The exterminator kept at it, setting traps and sealing every possible entry point he could find. Each day he'd report back grimly: more nests discovered, more structural damage, more evidence that these rats had been here long before we arrived and had absolutely no intention of leaving without a fight. One afternoon, while he was working in the basement, he called me down urgently. He'd uncovered something wedged between the old wooden support beams, a massive cavernous nest the size of a small car. It was packed full of shredded insulation, chewed wires, dirt, and bones. Lots of bones. Small ones, bird bones maybe. We started sleeping at a motel after that, unable to spend another night in the house. The exterminator's crew worked tirelessly for the next 2 weeks, and eventually, they declared the house clear. But by then, the damage had already been done. Not just to the house, but to us. Even empty, the place didn't feel like ours anymore. It felt like something else had claimed it long before we ever moved in. Buying my first house was supposed to be the best moment of my life. I was 27, had a stable job, and after years of renting, I was finally able to afford a place of my own. It wasn't huge, just a small 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind where people waved to each other in passing but mostly kept to themselves. The house was old, built in the 70s, but the previous owners had done some renovations. New floors, updated kitchen, fresh paint. It felt like a good deal. At first, everything seemed normal. I moved in, unpacked, and spent the first few weeks settling in. But little things started to feel off. First, it was the noises. At night, I'd hear soft creaking sounds from the attic. Nothing too weird. It was an old house, after all. But then I started hearing them during the day. Not just random settling noises, but shifting sounds, like something moving. I convinced myself it was just the house adjusting. But then I started noticing small things out of place. Drawers left slightly open. My bathroom door, which I always kept shut, cracked open just an inch when I came home from work. I started second-guessing myself. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Then one evening, I found the first real clue that something wasn't right. I was in my laundry room, which was in a small hallway near the back of the house. The hallway had a door leading to the backyard and another that led to the crawl space. A dark, low-ceilinged space under the house, mostly used for storage and plumbing access. I had never opened that door since moving in. No reason to. But that night, as I passed by, I noticed something. The door wasn't latched. It wasn't wide open, but it wasn't shut all the way either. Just enough to see the pitch-black darkness inside. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I reached out and pushed the door closed, making sure the latch caught this time. I even gave it a little tug to make sure it wouldn't pop back open. Then, out of pure paranoia, I grabbed a chair and shoved it in front of the door. Just in case. That should have been the end of it. But the next morning, the door was open again. Not just slightly open, wide open. The chair I had placed in front of it had been moved to the side. I grabbed my phone and called my best friend Jason. He lived about 10 minutes away and was at my house in record time. "Dude, you probably just forgot you moved it," he said. But I could tell he didn't believe it either. We decided to check the crawl space. The opening was tight, about 4 feet high, lined with concrete walls and dirt floors. Jason went first, crouching low, his flashlight sweeping through the space. I followed, my heart pounding. About 10 feet in, Jason froze. "Dude," he whispered. I stepped closer, my own flashlight shaking slightly as I aimed it where he was looking. In the farthest corner of the crawl space, behind some old wooden planks, was a sleeping bag. Next to it, a half-eaten granola bar. And next to that, a small pile of clothing. Someone had been living under my house. We backed out fast, barely breathing. I called the cops immediately. When they arrived, they searched the crawl space, but no one was there. They said whoever had been staying there must have slipped out when they heard us coming. The scariest part, the police found a small hole in the floorboards leading up to my laundry room. It was just big enough for someone to squeeze through. Someone had been coming into my house, probably at night, maybe while I was at work. I had been living with an intruder for weeks. Needless to say, I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had every single lock in the house replaced. I also installed cameras inside and outside my house. For a while, nothing happened. No strange noises, no open doors. But then, about a month later, my backyard camera caught something. At 3:12 a.m., a figure appeared at the edge of my property. A tall, thin man, wearing the same hoodie I had seen in the pile of clothes under my house. He stood there, just watching my house for over 5 minutes, before slowly disappearing into the darkness. I moved out 3 months later and finally sold the house yesterday. When my fiancé and I bought our first house, we thought we'd found the perfect place. It was a charming 2-story home in an older neighborhood, built in the 50s but well maintained. The price was surprisingly low for the area, but we chalked it up to the fact that the house needed some cosmetic work. It wasn't until after we moved in that we realized something was off. The first thing that struck me as weird was the locked room. The house had 3 bedrooms upstairs, plus an office on the first floor. But there was one door in the hallway that didn't match the others. It was painted a slightly different shade of white, and when we tried to open it on our first walkthrough, it wouldn't budge. The realtor told us the previous owner had passed away, and their family hadn't been able to locate the key. It was just a storage room, she said casually. It should have been a red flag. But at the time, we were just excited to have a place of our own. For the first few weeks, we ignored it. The house was old, so we focused on the little repairs, new paint, fixing squeaky doors, replacing a few light fixtures. The locked room sat untouched. Then one night, I was in bed scrolling on my phone when I heard something upstairs. It wasn't loud, just a faint creaking noise, like weight shifting on old floorboards. At first, I thought it was just my fiancé moving around in the other room. But when I turned over, I saw he was sound asleep beside me. I told myself it was just the house settling. But the sounds kept happening. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I'd hear soft thumps from the second floor, always near that locked room. Sometimes the floor creaked as if someone was walking inside. Then one evening, as I was heading upstairs, I felt it. The air near the locked door was cold. Not just cooler than the rest of the house. Unnaturally cold. I pressed my palm against the door. It felt icy. I finally snapped. I grabbed a hammer from the toolbox and told my fiancé we needed to get that door open. It took a few solid swings to break through the frame, but eventually, the door creaked open. And inside, it wasn't a storage room. It was a bedroom. The walls were a faded shade of blue. A twin bed sat against the far wall, covered in dust, as if no one had touched it for years. A small wooden desk sat in the corner, its drawers slightly open. A stuffed bear rested against the pillow, its fur yellowed with age. Everything looked untouched, frozen in time. But the worst part? There were scratches on the inside of the door. Long, deep scratches, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. I felt a pit open in my stomach. This wasn't just a storage space someone had forgotten about. This was a room that someone had been locked in. We didn't sleep that night. Instead, we did what we should have done before we bought the house. We looked up the address, and that's when we found it. 23 years ago, a boy had gone missing from this house. His parents told the police he had run away, but neighbors had whispered rumors that the father had been abusive, that the boy had been locked away in his own home. But there had never been any proof. No one had ever found the boy. And his parents? They had sold the house and left town right after the case was closed. I don't know what happened in that room. I don't know if the boy really ran away, or if something worse happened behind that locked door. But I do know one thing. The day after we opened the door, we moved out. Some things are better left untold. Buying my first house felt like the biggest accomplishment of my life. I had spent years grinding, late nights, early mornings, barely scraping by to get my business off the ground. But after years of hard work, I finally made it. My business was thriving, and I had saved enough to buy a home of my own. It wasn't a mansion or anything, but it was mine. A cozy 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood. The previous owner, an elderly woman, had passed away, and her family was selling it for cheap. The place needed some updating, but I didn't mind. It felt like a fresh start. At first, everything was perfect. I set up my home office, decorated the space how I wanted, and finally had room to breathe after years of struggling. But then, weird things started happening. Little things at first. I'd wake up and swear I had left a light on, but it would be off. A cabinet door in the kitchen that I knew I had closed would be slightly open. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just distracted, too busy running my business to notice. Then came the noises. At night, I'd hear soft, rustling sounds. Not pipes clanking or the house settling. Something moving. Sometimes it was in the walls. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from above me. One night, while I was finishing up work in my home office, I heard something that made my stomach drop. A faint cough. I froze. It was so soft, so distant, that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But my body knew better. That primal instinct kicked in, the one that tells you when something isn't right. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, my heavy-duty metal flashlight, and started checking the house. The front door was locked. The windows were shut. Everything looked normal. But the sound had come from inside the house. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, running on caffeine and paranoia, I decided to do a full sweep of the house. That's when I noticed something weird about the vents. They were huge. Not the standard small grates you see in most houses. These were wide, rectangular vents, large enough for someone to crawl through. I hadn't thought much of it before, but now, staring at them, I felt an uneasy chill creep over me. I needed to know what was inside. Grabbing a screwdriver, I unscrewed the vent cover in the hallway. I expected to see ductwork leading to the HVAC system. Instead, I saw footprints in the dust. Not rodent tracks. Not smudges from airflow. Bare human footprints. I felt my chest tighten. I checked another vent, the one in my bedroom. Same thing. The dust inside had been disturbed, like someone had crawled through it. My heart was racing now. I went into the basement where I had seen another large vent cover near the floor. Kneeling down, I took a deep breath and aimed my flashlight inside. And that's when I saw it. A blanket, a plastic water bottle, crumpled food wrappers. Someone had been living inside my vents. I scrambled back so fast I nearly fell. My hands were shaking as I called the police. They arrived within minutes and searched the house. At first, they found nothing. No forced entry, no obvious signs of a break-in. Then one officer pulled off the vent cover in the basement and looked inside. That's when they found a hidden crawl space. Inside, a sleeping bag, a backpack, a notebook. The officer flipped through the pages. His expression darkened. The notebook was full of notes about me. She works late. Leaves the back door unlocked sometimes. Keeps her bedroom window open at night. I felt sick. The police believed it was a squatter who had been secretly living inside the house before I moved in and had just never left. He had been watching me, learning my routines, probably slipping in and out whenever I wasn't home, or worse, while I was home, but asleep. I moved out that week. I don't know if they ever caught him. But sometimes late at night, when I hear the faint hum of an air vent, I wonder if he ever found a new home, or if he's still watching. I never thought a house could make me feel insane. When I finally bought my first home, I was beyond proud of myself. I had worked for years to build my own business, sacrificed sleep, a social life, and any sense of work-life balance. But it had finally paid off. I was a homeowner. The house was a modest but charming 3-bedroom in a nice neighborhood. The previous owner, an older man, had lived there alone for decades before passing away. His son, who lived out of state, just wanted to sell it quickly. I should have questioned why the house sat on the market for so long. I should have wondered why the price was so low. But I was caught up in the excitement, already picturing how I'd turn the spare bedroom into my dream home gym. I moved in during the summer, and for the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. But then, small weird things started happening. At night, I'd hear soft scratching inside the walls. Nothing crazy, just light, faint movements. I figured it was an old house settling, maybe a couple of mice. A problem, sure, but not a big deal. Then one morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. Teeth marks. Tiny, jagged bite marks on the edges of my kitchen cabinets. A small hole chewed into a bag of rice I had left on the counter overnight. Disgusting, but still, just rodents, right? I called an exterminator, expecting them to set a few traps and solve the problem. But when the guy showed up, he barely walked 2 steps inside before freezing. "Jesus," he muttered, looking around. "How long have you been living here?" I frowned. "Just a few weeks." He scratched the back of his head. "Has no one told you?" "Told me what?" He sighed. "I'll check it out, but you might want to start looking for another place." That was not what I wanted to hear. The exterminator walked the perimeter, checking for entry points, while I anxiously hovered behind him. He moved the fridge, pulled out the stove, and checked under the sink. And that's when I saw his face change. He pointed. "You see this?" I leaned in. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Just droppings. A lot of them. Then I noticed something worse. A hole in the wall. No bigger than a baseball, hidden behind the cabinets. The edges weren't just chewed. They were gnawed down to the studs, like something had been forcing its way in. The exterminator didn't say much after that. He just set the traps, handed me his card, and told me to call him if things got worse. I should have listened to the warning in his voice, because things got worse. That night, the scratching sounds inside the walls were louder, more urgent. I barely slept, convinced I could hear movement inside the vents. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen, groggy and irritated, until I saw my silverware drawer. It was open, which was weird because I never left drawers open. But when I looked closer, I felt a sick, crawling sensation spread across my skin. The forks and knives were covered in poop. Something had crawled onto my counters, into my drawers. I gagged and spent the entire day bleaching every surface of my kitchen. I called the exterminator back, demanding something stronger. He agreed to set more traps, but even he looked uneasy. A few days later, I woke up to a new sound. Not scratching. Breathing. I swear to you, I could hear it. This slow, rhythmic breathing inside the walls. The kind that fills a room in near silence. The kind that feels like something is lurking just out of sight. I told myself I was imagining things. I was sleep-deprived, paranoid, my brain playing tricks on me. Then the stench hit me. Rot. Something rotting. I followed the smell to my laundry room where the wall had started to bulge. My hands were shaking as I pressed against it. The drywall felt soft, damp. I barely had time to react before a hole burst open. And then they came pouring out. Rats. Dozens of them, falling from the walls, squealing, scrambling across the floor, climbing over each other in a frenzied panic. Some the size of house cats. I screamed and bolted out of the house so fast I nearly fell. The exterminator came back the next day, and what he found still haunts me. The house wasn't just infested. It was hollow. The previous owner hadn't just had a rat problem. He'd ignored it for years. The rats had been breeding, tunneling, expanding their network through the entire house. The walls were moving. The breathing I had heard. It wasn't my imagination. The entire house was alive with them. Nests built into every crevice, multiplying. I didn't spend another night there. I sold the house at a massive loss, warning the next buyer exactly what they were getting into. I don't think they listened. Buying a home was supposed to be the start of something great. I was 31, recently engaged, and I wanted to have a house ready before my fiancé and I officially started our lives together. I spent months looking for the perfect place. Something safe, quiet, and big enough to raise a family in. Eventually, I found it. A beautiful 3-bedroom home in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. It was well kept, had a big backyard, and was within walking distance of parks and good schools. Everything about it felt right, except for the neighbors. At first, I didn't think much of them. They were a middle-aged couple living directly across the street. Nothing unusual. But after a few weeks, I started to notice weird things. Every time I looked out my window, they were watching me, not in a "hey, welcome to the neighborhood" kind of way. I mean, standing at their windows, staring into my house. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe they just happened to be looking outside when I glanced their way. But it kept happening. Morning, night, middle of the afternoon. Every time I looked, at least one of them was standing at a window, staring. I told my fiancée about it, and she agreed it was weird. "Maybe they're just nosy," she suggested. I wanted to believe that. Then I started noticing things inside my house were off. Nothing huge. Just little things at first. A chair slightly moved from where I left it. A kitchen cabinet opened that I was sure I had closed. The feeling that something wasn't right. One night, I got home from work and saw the basement light was on. I never turned it on. That's when I decided to install cameras. I set them up around the house, inside and out. If something was happening, I was going to catch it. The footage nearly made me throw up. On my second night of reviewing the recordings, I saw them, my neighbors, entering my house. I watched in horror as they casually walked through my home while I was gone. They didn't steal anything. They didn't trash the place. They just looked. They walked from room to room, touching things, opening drawers, sitting on my furniture like they belonged there. I called the cops immediately. They took the footage as evidence and arrested the couple later that week. That should have been the end of it. But before they left, one of the officers told me something that still makes my skin crawl. You know, this isn't the first time we've dealt with them. I frowned. What do you mean? He sighed. The previous owners of your house, they reported the exact same thing. My blood went cold. The old owners had tried to press charges, but the couple had found some legal loophole, claiming they had a right to enter because the old owners had given them permission at some point. They were just doing it again, but this time, I had video proof. The case against them stuck. They were convicted for trespassing, stalking, and unlawful entry. And since they couldn't afford legal fees while in prison, their house went up for sale. And that's when I got an idea. I bought their house. I had no real reason. I just liked the idea of taking something from them after what they had done. But after the purchase, I found something I wasn't supposed to. During renovations, I noticed an odd section of the basement wall that sounded hollow. I figured it was just poor construction until I knocked hard enough to break through. Behind it was a hidden passage. The tunnel was narrow, dark, and led directly toward my old house. I followed it with a flashlight, my heart pounding. It was damp, unfinished, like an old maintenance tunnel. At the very end, the tunnel stopped, right at a false wall. I pushed against it. It gave way. I was inside my old house. The tunnel led to a closet in one of the bedrooms. That's how they had also been getting in. Not through a spare key. Not through some deal with the previous owners. They had a hidden tunnel. To this day, I don't know why.